Hey there, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we bring you a chilling collection of horror stories set against the soothing sound of rain. Before we dive into suspense, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. If these stories send shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear slowly take over, and tell us if you enjoy this kind of storytelling. Now sit back and relax, we're about to begin. Have you ever felt that moment when the weight of your own thoughts becomes too heavy to bear? When every breath feels like a reminder of your isolation, and every beat of your heart echoes with the doubt of your existence. I had never fully understood what it meant to feel like you were drowning in your own mind until that night. Until that dark, suffocating silence that seemed to envelop me and twist everything I thought I knew into something far more terrifying. It started with the sound. At first, it was just a faint hum, like the buzzing of a distant appliance, something so faint you could almost ignore it if you tried. But I couldn't ignore it. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, reverberating through my bones, like the world itself was trying to tell me something. Something I wasn't supposed to hear. I sat in my small, dimly lit apartment, staring at the same four walls that had surrounded me for months. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to be here. Alone. It was supposed to be comforting. But something about the quiet had begun to suffocate me. The walls, they didn't look the same anymore. The shadows beneath the furniture seemed to grow, stretching further than they should have. The corners of the room, once so familiar, seemed to curl in on themselves. It was as if the room itself had turned against me, like it was watching, waiting. The shadows no longer just hid in corners. They moved, shifted. I turned my gaze towards the window. Outside, the night was unremarkable. The streetlights hummed, casting long, fractured shadows across the sidewalk. Yet beneath the normalcy of it all, something felt wrong. The world was still, almost too still. No cars, no distant voices, not even the usual hum of the city. It was as if the entire world had frozen in time, and I was the only one left behind. My breath quickened and a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started with the little things. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the way the shadows moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. But then it became more noticeable. The hum, the thud of footsteps in the hallway, the quiet rustling of something just beyond the door. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an old pipe groaning under the strain of the cold. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized, whatever it wasn't natural. I had to leave. I stood up abruptly, but my body felt heavy. Like I was walking through water. My legs seemed to move slower than they should, as if they were dragging through an invisible fog. The air felt thick, suffocating, and my heartbeat grew louder in my ears. The more I focused on the feeling of unease, the more intense it became. I reached the door, my hand gripping the cold, brass handle. But I hesitated. There was something outside. I knew it. I could feel it deep in my gut, in the pit of my stomach. I could feel its presence. Its eyes watching me. Waiting. I turned away, slowly backing away from the door. My breath was shallow, my pulse racing in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I collapsed back onto the couch, pressing my hands to my face as though to block out the world. My fingers trembled. It wasn't just the sound now. It was the way everything seemed to close in around me. The darkness was no longer a comfort. It was a cage, a trap, and then I heard it. A soft whisper. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it came again, clearer this time. The words were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were unmistakable. You're not alone. I froze. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. It felt like it was coming from all around me, as if it was seeping out of the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. I stood up quickly, scanning the room. The shadows were still there, but now they seemed to be alive. They were shifting, moving with purpose, stretching towards me, as if they were reaching out. And the longer I stared at them, the more they seemed to grow. To multiply. I'm losing it, I thought to myself. I'm imagining things. I just need to calm down. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, no matter how much I told myself it wasn't real, the more the feeling grew. The weight of my own thoughts began to suffocate me, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Maybe I'm going crazy. But then again, what if I was? The room seemed to close in on me, the shadows in the corners growing darker, thicker. I could feel them moving now, like tendrils creeping towards me. The air itself felt heavy, as though I was drowning in it. The walls seemed to be pressing in from all sides, and the faint whisper came again, louder this time. You can't escape. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. There was no way out. No escape. The more I tried to distance myself from the overwhelming terror, the more it gripped me. The shadows weren't just in the corners, they were inside me. A reflection of the fear that had been growing in the back of my mind for weeks. I wasn't trapped in this room. I was trapped in myself. And no matter where I went or how far I tried to run, it would always follow. It would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. The darkness had already taken hold, and now there was nowhere to hide. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My mind was spiraling, caught in a vortex of fear and confusion. I sat frozen in that dimly lit room, my gaze fixated on the shadows creeping across the walls. The voice, that whisper, echoed in my ears. It was everywhere. You can't escape. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The air around me felt thick, like I was suffocating in a fog that I couldn't see but could feel, pressing against my skin. My lungs burned, desperate for air, but it felt as though the very atmosphere was turning against me. I opened my eyes, searching for any sign of something, anything, that might bring me back to reality. The shadows seemed to move, alive and sentient, twisting in unnatural ways. They reached for me, expanding, contracting, as though they had a mind of their own. The corners of the room blurred, the walls no longer just enclosing the space, but closing in inch by inch, pressing down on me. I was no longer sitting in my apartment. I was trapped in a space that didn't follow the rules of reality. You're alone, the voice continued, this time clearer, sharper. Alone, with your thoughts. I tried to speak, to ask who was there, but my voice failed me. I couldn't find the words. There was no one else here, was there? Was I losing my grip on what was real? My thoughts turned over and over like a wheel spinning too fast, threatening to snap. I reached out, my hand trembling as I tried to touch the walls to prove that they were still real. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the walls felt wrong, cold, unyielding. The chill seeped into my skin, spreading through me like ice water. The walls were no longer solid. They felt like they were breathing. My mind raced. It's not real. It's not real, I repeated to myself, but the words felt hollow. They had no weight, no power. The faint whisper persisted. You can't hide. I jumped to my feet, a desperate need to escape filling me, but the room seemed to stretch farther and farther away with each step I took. It was as though the very space I occupied was warping, bending to some unseen force. The shadows multiplied, now more than just flickers. They were solid, dark shapes that moved with intention, creeping closer. I could feel them, no, I could feel it, surrounding me, tightening like a vice. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady rhythm that was growing faster, more erratic. My thoughts scattered. I couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming sense of doom. The floor creaked beneath me and I froze. Was that a footstep? Or had I imagined it? My body jerked towards the sound, but there was no one there. I was alone. Alone. Except for this. The voice. The shadows. The choking, suffocating fear that pressed in on me from all sides. You're not alone, it said again, and this time it was louder. Closer. I could almost feel the words vibrating in my chest. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to locate the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Nothing but the growing darkness that surrounded me. It was getting harder to see, the shadows thickening, the room dimming to a point where the familiar objects, the couch, the coffee table, the window, were nothing more than vague shapes lost in the blackness. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, struggling to maintain my balance. I reached out, hoping for something solid to cling to, but all I found was emptiness. The walls, the floor, they were shifting, like they were alive, moving in response to my panic. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. Every step I took seemed to drag me deeper into this nightmare, the distance between me and the door growing with each passing second. The whispers became louder, turning into voices, murmurs, conversations I couldn't make out. Were they real? Or were they just my mind shattering? I turned again. The window. The window that had always been my only escape from the closed room, the only connection to the world outside. I ran toward it, my feet stumbling as I moved. But when I reached the window, it was no longer there. Instead, the glass had vanished, replaced by a thick, swirling fog that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It writhed like something trying to break free, like something clawing its way into the room. My hand trembled as I reached forward, desperate to touch the cool glass, to feel the world outside, but all I felt was the oppressive, dense fog pressing against my skin. The fog didn't feel cold. It felt alive. I recoiled, my pulse racing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, like something rotting. Something decaying. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. I had heard that sound before. It was the sound of something unnatural. Something that didn't belong in this world. The shadows were moving faster now, swirling around me in an uncoordinated frenzy. The walls of the room, the very structure of my reality, seemed to be bending and warping as if the world itself was collapsing into some dark abyss. "You can't escape," the voice hissed one last time, its tone mocking, twisted. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Whatever it was in the room with me. The presence, the weight of it, pressing in on me from every direction. I was no longer in control of my own body, my thoughts, my reality. The terror was consuming me. And I knew then, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone. I was never alone. I had never been alone. The darkness wasn't just around me. It was inside me. And now it was waiting. The darkness enveloped me like a thick, suffocating blanket. I gasped for air, but it was as if the atmosphere had been replaced with something heavier, more oppressive. Every breath felt like I was inhaling something sharp, painful. The growl that had echoed in my ears seemed to reverberate in my bones, shaking me to my very core. I turned wildly, my hands reaching out, desperately searching for anything solid, anything real. But it was all gone. The room had ceased to exist as I knew it. The walls no longer felt like walls. The floor was no longer solid ground beneath my feet. It was as if everything I had once known was dissolving into nothingness, leaving me stranded in a void. "Please," I whispered, my voice a hoarse plea. "Please, make it stop." But there was no response, no comfort to be found. The room didn't even have the decency to stay still. The floor seemed to ripple beneath my feet, as though the very foundation of this place was being churned by some unseen force. The shadows twisted and expanded, multiplying around me, moving in erratic, disjointed patterns. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were like tendrils reaching for me, crawling across the floor, up the walls, and even across the ceiling. I could feel their presence, the way they seemed to pull at my skin, like the weight of 1,000 hands pressing down on me. Every inch of the room felt alive with an energy I couldn't explain. And the air, God, the air, felt like it was thick with something dark, something wrong. "You can't escape," the voice taunted again, but it wasn't the same voice I had heard before. This one was darker, more insistent, as though it had gained power, feeding off my terror. It was no longer just a whisper. It was everywhere. In the walls, in the floor, in my mind. I staggered backward, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind reeling. I needed to get out. I needed to escape, but where? Where could I go when even the very air was trying to swallow me whole? The fog was thickening, wrapping itself around me, pulling at me like it had weight. It wasn't just mist. It was a substance. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape, a figure. At first, I thought it was just another trick of my mind, a shadow stretching too far, warping in the darkness. But no, it was moving, slowly and stealthily. Its form was vaguely human, but there was something off about it, something wrong in the way it shifted, as though it was no longer bound by the laws of reality. I froze. The figure was walking toward me, its movements deliberate, controlled. Each step it took made the air around me grow colder, heavier. It was as though every inch it moved brought with it an aura of dread, of something ancient and evil. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the terror rising inside me like a tidal wave. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body wouldn't obey. It was as though I was paralyzed by the presence of that thing coming toward me. It stopped, right in front of me. I could hear its breathing, or what I thought was breathing. It sounded like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind, faint and dry, like something that had been buried for centuries. But it wasn't just the sound that terrified me. It was the scent. A rotting stench filled the air, something putrid, decayed, like death itself was breathing on me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, suffocating. The thing reached out slowly, its hand, a hand that wasn't quite human, with too many fingers, too long, too twisted, extended toward me. And then I saw its face, or what I thought was a face. It was pale, too pale, and covered in an oily sheen, as if it had been submerged in something dark for too long. There were no eyes, just smooth, empty sockets where they should have been. And its mouth, it opened wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to, revealing teeth, jagged and sharp, stained with something I couldn't see but could feel. The thing smiled, if you could call it that, a grotesque, twisted grin that stretched far beyond the normal limits of the human face. You think you can escape, it hissed, its voice like the grinding of stones, low and guttural. You think you can leave this place. But there is no escape. There is only me. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating like a horrible song, a chant I couldn't silence. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body was frozen, my muscles stiff, unresponsive. The figure in front of me leaned closer, its breath, if you could call it that, washing over me like a wave of cold, suffocating air. The smell of decay was stronger now, more overwhelming. It filled my senses, clogging my throat, making me gag. You will stay here, it whispered, its voice slithering in my ear. Forever. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body was shaking violently, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The thing's hand reached for my face, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. I flinched, the touch icy like a grave's chill. Suddenly a sharp crack, like the sound of bones snapping, filled the room. The walls shuddered, the floor groaned underfoot, and the air turned thick with tension. The thing's hand pulled back, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, lingering, as if waiting for something. And then I understood. It wasn't just after me. It was after everything. The walls seemed to bend even further, the shadows deepening, taking on more weight, more shape. The room was no longer a room. It was a prison, a trap, and I was its prisoner. I could feel my heart racing, its erratic beats pounding in my chest, each one a violent reminder of my vulnerability. The air around me seemed to thicken with each breath I took, like it was pressing in, suffocating me from all sides. I couldn't see anything clearly anymore, just dark shapes and shifting shadows, blurring into one monstrous, nightmarish figure that loomed over me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body refused to move. The thing that stood before me, its grotesque smile still etched on its face, its eyes mere black voids, wasn't just a physical threat. It had become something far worse. It was inside my head now, crawling through my thoughts, twisting them, distorting them until nothing felt real anymore. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you?" But the thing didn't answer. Instead, it took another step toward me. The floor beneath my feet groaned under its weight, and I felt the ground shift, as if the entire room was alive, as if everything around me was bending to the will of that thing. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, my hands grasping desperately for anything to steady myself. The walls were pulsing now, each throb a dark rhythm, as though the very room was breathing. I could almost hear it, the sickening sound of something ancient, something deeply wrong. The shadows seemed to grow longer with every passing second, stretching toward me like tendrils, wrapping around my legs, pulling me down, dragging me into the abyss. "You think you can escape," the voice echoed through the room, now deeper, more menacing. "You belong here. You have always belonged here." The words were like daggers in my mind, twisting and turning until I felt like I was drowning in them. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts, but the more I fought, the more the darkness closed in around me. The thing took another step, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. I could feel it pressing in on me, pushing me toward the edge of insanity. And yet, part of me wondered if I had already crossed that line. Was this really happening? Was any of this real? Or had I finally lost my mind, trapped in some endless nightmare of my own making? I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that now enveloped me. The air was so thick I could barely move, let alone shout for someone to hear me. It was as if everything in the world had disappeared, leaving only this shadow, this creature, and the crushing weight of my own fear. I turned in every direction, looking for something, anything that could help me, but there was nothing. The room had completely transformed into a twisted labyrinth of shadows and shifting shapes. Every surface was coated in a layer of blackness, every corner a potential hiding place for some new terror. The light flickered faintly above me, casting strange, distorted shapes on the walls, making it impossible to trust anything I saw. The figure was closer now, its movements slow but deliberate, each step echoing in the silence like a death knell. Its smile widened, impossibly so, stretching across its face like a rift in the very fabric of reality. I could feel its eyes, those empty, soulless voids, fixed on me, watching, waiting. Its presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest, crushing me with each passing second. "You can't fight it," the voice whispered. "You can't run. You will never escape." I shut my eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to escape the suffocating pressure of its presence. But when I opened them again, the room had changed once more. It wasn't just the walls or the shadows. The very nature of the space had warped, as if time itself had fractured. I looked around, my mind reeling in confusion. The familiar room, the one I had once known, was gone. In its place was a twisted mockery of the real world. The walls were covered in cracks, like the skin of some monstrous creature, oozing with dark, viscous liquid. The floor was slick, wet, and it creaked as though it was alive, shifting beneath me. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob, but it didn't open. It was as if the very act of escaping had been forbidden, as if the room itself was holding me captive, keeping me trapped inside its nightmarish confines. You are mine now, the voice purred, its tone almost soothing, like a lover's whisper. And I will never let you go. I tried to scream again, but the sound was swallowed by the walls. The air grew colder and I could see my breath, misting in the freezing darkness. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, until there was barely room to breathe. The figure was now standing right in front of me. Its long, twisted hand reached out again, brushing against my cheek, its fingers ice cold and unnaturally long. I flinched, but there was nowhere to go. It was everywhere now. Its presence filled the room, filled my mind, until I could no longer distinguish the reality from the nightmare. "This is your fate," it whispered, its voice sinking deep into my thoughts. "This is where you will remain. Forever." And as it spoke those words, I felt something inside me snap. I could feel the weight of the room, the weight of the thing, pressing down on me, suffocating me in its darkness. I could feel my sanity slipping, my mind breaking apart at the seams. I tried to resist, tried to fight back, but the force of the creature's presence was overwhelming. My mind, once a fragile but functioning thing, was now a labyrinth of twisting corridors and distorted visions. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. "You are mine," the creature repeated, its voice now a soft, melodic hum. And in that moment, I finally understood. This wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real, and there was no escaping it. There never had been. I could feel the air around me vibrating with an unnatural stillness, the silence so deep it was suffocating. My mind swam in a fog of confusion, but somewhere deep down, I knew it wasn't just the creature's presence that threatened to tear me apart. It was the emptiness that followed it, the complete and utter isolation that gripped me tighter than any chains ever could. I couldn't look away from the thing, not because I wanted to keep my eyes fixed on it, but because its gaze, those empty, black holes where eyes should have been, had a power over me. It felt like they were pulling me in, sucking the last remnants of hope from my body. It wasn't just its physical presence anymore. It was its voice, its thoughts, worming their way into my head, making me doubt everything I knew. "You don't belong there," it whispered, its voice almost tender now, like a parent scolding a child. "You never did." I wanted to scream until my throat bled, but the words were caught somewhere between my chest and my lips, stuck in the pit of my stomach. It was like trying to speak underwater, futile. I was paralyzed, my mind and body completely consumed by the creature's dark influence. The walls around me, no, the entire room began to warp once again, shifting like liquid, as if I were trapped inside some kind of organic entity. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment, swallowing me into some abyss of nothingness. I gripped the nearest surface for support, but even the walls felt alive, pulsating under my touch as though they were breathing in unison with me, feeding off my fear. In the corner of the room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A dark figure, small at first, but growing larger with each passing second. It seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a glitch in reality, and with every shift, I could hear a faint echo of a voice. "A whisper, a name. What is this? Amazing." I tried to focus, my mind scrambling to make sense of the vision, but the words blurred together like ink dissolving in water. I reached toward the flickering figure, my hand shaking as it extended into the space between us. My fingers brushed against the air, feeling cold, like the temperature had dropped even lower in this suffocating room. The figure stopped moving, solidifying for a brief moment, and I could feel it staring at me. It was as if I was looking at a reflection of myself, but not the version I recognized. This version of me was broken, lost, eyes wide in terror and confusion, mirroring the feelings that had consumed me since I entered this nightmare. And then in a heartbeat, it was gone. Gone. I stumbled backward, the room spinning around me. My breathing was shallow, erratic, and every breath felt like it was strangling me. I couldn't focus, couldn't think. My vision blurred and everything began to fragment. Was I going mad? Was I dying? No, I couldn't give in. Not yet. But the more I tried to fight, the more it felt like the room was closing in, pressing down on me, as though the very walls were collapsing in on themselves, inch by inch. The floor was no longer stable beneath me. It was soft, spongy, as though it was made of flesh, shifting and pulsing with each of my steps. I stumbled, caught myself on the edge of the broken table, the wood splintering under my hands. There was a moment of sharp pain, a brief flicker of clarity in the chaos. I wiped the blood from my palms, and then, through the pain, I realized something. The creature was feeding off my fear. It was drawing power from my confusion, my panic. And the longer I allowed myself to sink into the terror it invoked, the more it would consume me. The room, the walls, the shadows, they were all part of it. I had to break free. Somehow. But as I looked around, it was impossible to find an exit. The door, if there was one, had vanished. The very concept of escape felt like a distant memory, fading into the haze. What if I couldn't leave? What if there was no way out? There is no escape, the creature murmured again, its voice slipping into my thoughts, twisting my perception of reality. You will stay here. Forever. I forced myself to take another step, the floor beneath me squelching like wet mud. The sound of it echoed in the space, reverberating off the walls. I couldn't hear anything else, no footsteps, no rustling, just the deafening thrum of my heartbeat filling my head. And then, as if to amplify my isolation, I realized I couldn't even hear my own breathing anymore. The silence was absolute, like the room had absorbed everything, leaving only the haunting presence of the creature. And then suddenly a new sound emerged. A faint creaking like a door opening. I whipped my head around, my pulse spiking, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The creaking grew louder, more distinct, until I could feel the vibrations beneath my feet. I turned back toward the corner of the room, where a sliver of light had begun to appear. It was weak at first, just a thin crack in the darkness. But with each passing moment, it grew wider, and I could feel something stirring inside me. Something hope. The flickering figure appeared again, its form more solid now, and it was beckoning me toward the light. You can leave, it whispered, its voice now softer, almost familiar. It's waiting for you. The door in the corner. Was it real? Was it really there, or was it another illusion the creature had crafted to trap me deeper into its mind games? I had to move. I didn't care anymore. My feet carried me toward the door, and the air seemed to part in front of me, opening the way. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, but I kept moving, focusing only on the sliver of light ahead. But as I reached the door, something pulled at my shoulder. Cold fingers brushed my skin, and I froze, feeling the familiar weight of the creature's presence closing in again. "You can't escape me," it whispered in my ear, so close that I could feel its breath. "You are mine, always." And with those words, the door in front of me slammed shut, the light vanishing into nothingness. I was trapped again, and this time I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to escape. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How could something so small, so insignificant, cause this much dread? I've always been curious, perhaps too curious for my own good. But even I didn't expect what I would find. I was cleaning out the attic of the old house, the one I'd inherited from my late uncle. He had been a recluse, never speaking much to anyone, leaving behind only his work and strange relics that never seemed to make sense. The house itself had a peculiar atmosphere, as though the walls whispered secrets that could not be understood. I never liked staying there too long, but after his passing, I was left with no choice. Sorting through his things was supposed to be a quick task, just pack up his things and sell the house. At least that was the plan. That's when I found it. A small, unmarked flash drive, buried in the bottom of an old, leather-bound box. Its dull, matte surface gleamed in the dim light from the overhead bulb. It looked harmless, even ordinary. But something about it felt wrong. Almost as if it had been waiting for me. I hesitated. The rational part of my mind told me it was just a forgotten piece of technology from years ago. Yet a strange compulsion urged me to plug it into my laptop. What harm could there be in just taking a quick look? I didn't realize then that the moment I inserted the drive, I was inviting something far worse than a file into my life. The screen flickered before displaying a folder labeled private. Inside, I found several video files, each one time-stamped with dates that seemed oddly familiar, but I couldn't place why. As I clicked on the first one, a chill ran down my spine. The footage began, and I immediately recognized the street outside my window, the one I walked down every day. But something was wrong with it. The images were distorted, blurry, as though they were trying to escape from the screen. The camera moved shakily, pointing at a familiar, decaying house that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. But there was a figure standing in the yard. It wasn't clear, but it looked like someone I knew. Someone I couldn't quite recall. The video ended abruptly, leaving me in an uncomfortable silence. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, not knowing whether I should press play on the next file or shut the laptop and pretend none of it ever happened. But the curiosity, the same curiosity that had led me to this point, pushed me forward. I clicked on the second file. This time the footage was clearer. The same figure appeared again, standing in the same yard. But now there was something else. A shape in the window behind the figure, lurking in the shadows. It was a distorted face, a face that I couldn't quite recognize, but also felt disturbingly familiar. I felt my chest tighten. I had to stop. I had to turn it off. But I didn't. I watched the rest of the videos. Each one revealed more footage of my city, places I knew too well, the park, the street corner, the local cafe. But in every video, something was wrong. The figures in the background, the strange shapes that flickered at the edges of the frame. Each one seemed to be growing closer to the people I knew, people I cared about. And then I saw the last video. It was a recording from inside the house. My uncle's house. I could hear his voice in the background, though the words were garbled and muffled, as though the camera was fighting against the sound. But it wasn't the voice that terrified me. It was the shadow that appeared in the corner of the room, creeping slowly towards the camera. It looked almost like a person, but its movements weren't human. The figure stopped in front of the camera, and I felt a cold rush of fear. Then the video cut off, leaving only darkness on the screen. I stared at the empty blackness, my mind racing. How was this possible? These were places I knew. These were people I had seen with my own eyes. But this wasn't reality. This wasn't right. The videos weren't from the past. They were happening now. I felt a creeping sensation, like I was being watched. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of my laptop. I shakily closed the laptop, my hands trembling. But as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the screen. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that I had been too immersed in the videos. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I needed to know more. I had to understand what was going on. Who was filming these events? Why were they happening? And more importantly, why did it feel like they were connected to me? Suddenly a sound broke the silence, the faintest creak, almost imperceptible, as if something was moving upstairs. The house groaned as if it had come alive, and I felt my pulse quicken. Was someone else in the house? I rose from my seat, my heart pounding, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I held my breath, straining to listen. But there was nothing. Only the distant hum of my laptop. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a heavy cloak. I was imagining things. But as I stood there in the dim light, I felt the presence of something unseen, something waiting. And then I heard it. A voice faint but unmistakable. It's not over. It came from somewhere deep in the house. I froze. The words echoed in my mind, sending a wave of cold through my body. I knew without a doubt that the nightmare had only just begun. I couldn't move. I stood frozen in the dim light of the attic, my ears straining to catch any hint of the voice again. The house felt eerily still, yet it was as though the air itself was thick with an unseen presence. The oppressive silence almost suffocated me. It's not over. The words echoed again in my mind. But this time they were not faint. They were sharper, closer, like they were coming from within the house itself. I slowly turned my head, scanning the dark corners of the room. Every shadow felt alive, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts that were rushing in. It's just the house, I muttered under my breath, trying to reassure myself. But deep down, I knew it was. It wasn't just the house, and it wasn't just the videos. Something was wrong, horribly, terribly wrong. I walked over to the laptop, my hands trembling as I reached for it. I needed to see more. I had to understand. The last video, the one from inside my uncle's house, kept playing in my mind. The figure, the shadow that moved too quickly, too unnaturally. It had felt like it was aware of me, as though it had been waiting for me to discover the truth. The laptop screen flickered to life as I opened it again. The files were still there, all of them. But my eyes were drawn to the folder that had been buried beneath all the others, one I hadn't seen before. The folder was labeled before. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen it earlier. It was like it had appeared out of nowhere. Without thinking, I clicked on it. The first video began, and this time the footage was clear. It showed a woman, a young woman, walking down a familiar street. I froze. It was my mother. I had to blink several times to confirm it. The video was old, grainy, but unmistakably her. She was walking towards the same park I used to visit as a child, her face filled with a distant expression, as though she was lost in thought. But something wasn't right. The video was silent, no sounds at all except the soft scuff of her shoes against the pavement. It was as if time had slowed down for her, as though she were trapped in a moment that couldn't end. As she reached the park, a figure appeared behind her, someone in a dark coat, face hidden in shadow. The figure followed her, never getting too close, but always remaining in the frame, a presence that felt unnervingly constant. The camera moved erratically, almost like it was trying to avoid the figure, but it was always there, lurking at the edges of the shot. The video ended abruptly. I sat there, my mind reeling. My mother. Why was she in this footage? And who was following her? Why was this on the flash drive? I had always known that my mother had some kind of connection to this town's dark past. She had never spoken about it much, and I had always assumed it was something personal, something she didn't want to remember. But this was something different. The second video in the folder was even more unsettling. It showed the same park, but this time my mother wasn't in it. The camera focused on the bench near the old oak tree, the one I used to sit on when I was a child. The bench was empty, but there was something about the way the camera lingered on it, something strange, like it was waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, a shadow crossed the bench, and I saw it. A figure. The same figure from the first video. But this time it was standing beside the bench, its face still hidden in the darkness. I couldn't breathe. My hand hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. I wanted to close the video, to shut it all out, but I couldn't. Something inside me told me that I was getting closer to something important. To the truth. I clicked on the next video. This one was different. It wasn't filmed from a hidden camera, but rather from what seemed like a stationary security camera. The footage showed a dimly lit hallway, one that looked hauntingly familiar. The camera was positioned at the far end of the hallway, facing a door. I recognized the door. It was the same one in my uncle's house, the one at the end of the corridor, the one that had always been locked. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The door creaked open, and I saw a figure step out from behind it. It was the same figure from the other videos, but now it was clearer, closer. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, its face still obscured by shadows. But there was something chilling about its posture. It was unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something or someone. I felt my heart race as I watched the figure move down the hallway, slowly, deliberately. The camera followed its movements, tracking it step by step until the figure stopped in front of another door. The door that led to my uncle's study. The figure didn't open the door. Instead, it simply stood there, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. Then, with an unnatural jerk, it turned its head toward the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. For a brief moment, the figure's face came into view, just enough for me to see the twisted, contorted features of a woman's face. My stomach churned. Before I could react, the video cut off. My laptop screen went black. I sat there staring at the blank screen, unable to process what I had just seen. My mind was racing. The figure, the woman, the connection, it all pointed to my uncle and my mother. The words that I had heard earlier echoed in my mind again. It's not over. I had uncovered something, but I didn't know if I was ready for it. The past was coming back, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I grabbed my coat, my hands shaking. I needed answers. I needed to find out what had happened to my uncle, what he had been hiding. I had to go back to the house. I had to confront the truth. The night air felt thick as I stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, doing little to calm the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I knew what I had to do. There was no turning back now. The truth, whatever it was, had its claws in me, and I couldn't escape it. I pulled the collar of my coat tighter around my neck as I made my way to the old car parked at the end of the driveway. My uncle's house was only a few miles away, but with each step, the weight of the darkness around me grew heavier. The once familiar streets seemed foreign now, as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, but the images from the videos kept flashing before my eyes. The figure, the strange woman's face, the unnerving silence that had followed each piece of footage. I could still hear her voice in my head, soft but persistent. It's not over. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, a result of my mind connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. There was something far worse at play here, something I hadn't even begun to understand. The drive to my uncle's house was uneventful, but the closer I got, the more intense the feeling of dread became. It was as if the town itself was warning me, urging me to turn around and forget everything. The house loomed in the distance, dark and imposing, like a sentient being waiting for me to arrive. I parked in front of the house, the headlights casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The windows were dark, the house seeming lifeless from the outside. But I knew better. I had been inside this house before many times. It had always felt like a place of safety, of belonging. But now it felt like something else, a tomb, a place where secrets rotted beneath the floorboards. As I walked up the creaky porch steps, I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, heavy with the memories of the past. The door was locked, just like it had been when I left. I took out the spare key from under the mat and turned it in the lock. The door swung open with a soft groan, the sound echoing through the empty house. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and dust filling my lungs. But it wasn't just the smell of a forgotten home. It was the smell of something more, something that hadn't been aired out in years. The house had been abandoned for so long, but there was a lingering presence here, one that didn't belong. I turned on the hallway light, but the bulb flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The house was still. Too still. It's not over. The words burned in my mind again, louder this time. I clenched my fists, trying to shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that had been waiting for me. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps soft on the creaky floorboards. The familiar pictures on the walls seemed distorted in the dim light. Their frames were cracked, the glass dusty. It was as if the house had aged in a way that defied time. But I couldn't stop now. I needed to get to the basement, to the place where the worst memories of my uncle were buried. I reached the basement door, the same one I had seen in the videos, the one that led to the room where he'd hidden everything. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint glow of light from below. My heart raced. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the house since I arrived. I was alone, but that didn't make sense. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The stairs descended into darkness, but there was an unnatural light coming from below. Not from a lamp or a bulb, but from something else. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. There was something alive down there. I made my way down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was vast, filled with boxes and old furniture. But it was the far corner of the room that caught my attention. The same corner where I'd seen the old bookshelf in the videos. The bookshelf that had always seemed out of place. I moved toward it, my body tense with anticipation. As I got closer, I could see that the bookshelf was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow passage behind it. A passage that led to another door. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, but I couldn't. Some force was pulling me forward. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I grasped the cold handle. With a slow, deliberate motion, I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small room. A room that had been hidden from the rest of the house for years. It was damp and cold, the walls covered in a thick layer of mold. But it was the center of the room that drew me in. A large wooden table sat in the middle, covered with old photographs, papers, and what appeared to be faded newspaper clippings. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the papers. The clippings were all about disappearances, people who had gone missing in the town over the years. Names I didn't recognize, dates from long before my time. But as I dug deeper, I found a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of my uncle. But he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a woman. A woman I didn't recognize. Her face was obscured, but her posture, her presence, felt familiar. It was as though I had seen her before, but I couldn't place where. The edges of the photo were torn, the picture yellowed with age. But it wasn't just the photograph that caught my attention. It was the note attached to it, hastily written in my uncle's handwriting. She's back. She's never left. The room felt smaller suddenly, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air heavy with the weight of something long forgotten. I knew with an absolute certainty that I had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. I backed away from the table, my mind racing with questions. Who was the woman? Why had my uncle kept this hidden? And what had happened to him? I turned to leave the room, but as I did, I heard a sound. A soft scraping noise coming from the far end of the basement. Something or someone was moving in the dark. I wasn't alone anymore. The scraping noise continued, a slow, deliberate sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, the air growing heavier with every breath I took. The cold seeped into my bones, and I realized that my breath was visible in the dim light. It hadn't been like that before. I took a step backward, my eyes scanning the room in a desperate search for the source of the noise. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were alive, shifting and moving. But there was nothing visible, nothing I could see clearly. It was all in the dark, just out of reach. I strained my ears, trying to focus on the sound. It was closer now, no longer scraping, but shuffling footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. The noise was unmistakable. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but my feet were frozen to the floor. I didn't know if it was fear or if something was keeping me here, rooted to the spot. I thought about the figure in the videos, the shadowy presence that had followed my mother and my uncle. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Could it be? Could it be here now in this house? Was I finally confronting whatever had been lurking in the past, waiting for me to discover the truth? The scraping continued, the sound now accompanied by a low, guttural murmur. It wasn't words, just noise. But the more I listened, the more it felt like it was directed at me, like it knew I was there. The room suddenly seemed smaller, more confined, as though the walls were closing in. The temperature had dropped even further, the chill settling into my skin like ice. I could see my breath now, puffing in small clouds in front of me. I turned toward the table, my eyes falling on the photographs and papers again. But they didn't offer me any answers. They only raised more questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was here, whatever had been in the house before, was still there, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. Then, through the murk of the shadows, I saw it. A figure, just a glimpse, standing at the edge of the room. It was a silhouette at first, too dark to make out any details. But I could see it move, slowly, almost painfully. The figure's form seemed to distort with every step it took, as though it was shifting between dimensions, flickering in and out of focus. I felt my legs tremble beneath me, the panic rising in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood there transfixed, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure that was moving closer. The shuffling footsteps grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't walking anymore, it was crawling. The sound of its hands scraping against the floor, dragging itself, was enough to make me gag. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Then, in a moment that felt like it lasted an eternity, the figure stopped. I saw the shape of it more clearly now. It was humanoid but wrong. so wrong. Its limbs were twisted, bent at odd angles, like it hadn't been made to move that way. The figure's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and I could see something glinting in the darkness where its eyes should have been. I had no words. My throat was tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. The thing, I didn't know what it was staring directly at me, and I could feel it. I could feel its gaze, like cold fingers brushing against my skin. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were garbled, as if they had to fight their way through some twisted distortion. But they were clear enough. My blood ran cold, my legs buckling beneath me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in fear. It was too late. I had uncovered something that shouldn't have been uncovered, something that had been waiting for me, for anyone foolish enough to open the door to the past. I took a shaky step backward and then another. My mind was racing, but my body wasn't responding the way I needed it to. The figure moved again, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it began to crawl toward me, the sound of its bones scraping against the floor like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard. It was getting closer, faster now, as if it was sensing my terror feeding off it. No, I thought, I can't let it get me. But my thoughts were jumbled and fear blurred everything. Without thinking, I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the table. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything to use, anything to protect myself. But there was nothing. It was then that I realized something worse. The door to the basement had closed. Somehow, without me hearing it, the door had shut behind me, trapping me inside with that thing. I grabbed the doorknob, my hand shaking violently, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was pressing against it from the other side, preventing me from escaping. I turned to face the creature again, the dark shape now so close that I could see the jagged outline of its body. Its face was twisted, a grotesque mask of an old woman, eyes too wide, mouth stretched into a smile that made my stomach churn. The woman, the one from the photographs, her features were unmistakable. "It's time," the figure hissed, its voice a rasping, guttural sound. Time for what? What was it trying to tell me? My head spun, my vision blurred as my legs buckled beneath me. And then, as if the world had been held together by some fragile thread, everything went black. I collapsed into the darkness, unsure of what was real anymore, unsure if I was even alive. The world around me was black, but it wasn't the comforting black of sleep. It was suffocating, pressing against my chest, suffusing every corner of my mind. My eyes snapped open, and I was no longer in the basement. The air was thick and musty, and the walls were familiar, yet unfamiliar. The space around me felt wrong, distorted. I could hear nothing but my own shallow breaths. I reached out instinctively, my hand grazing against a rough surface. The floor beneath me was cold and damp. I tried to push myself up, but my muscles felt like lead, slow and unwilling to move. Panic surged through me. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I tried to remember what had happened, where I was, what I had just seen. That thing, the woman, the crawling figure. I blinked, desperately trying to clear the fog in my mind. The dim light of the room slowly began to sharpen, and the walls materialized before me, old wood splintered in places. The room I found myself in now was not the basement where I had collapsed, but a small, enclosed space I didn't recognize. It was as though I had been transported into another dimension entirely, one that stretched the boundaries of reality. It felt like a dream. It couldn't be real, but every part of me told me it was. I managed to push myself into a sitting position, my body stiff and trembling. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was something deeper, something primal. Something that chilled me from the inside out. I could still feel the traces of the thing's presence, lingering in the air like a stale smell, clinging to the walls and the floor. It was as though it had left part of itself behind, its essence, its touch, and it was here with me. I stood shakily, my knees threatening to buckle as I moved through the cramped space. The dim light came from a flickering bulb above my head. The room was filled with shadows, and I could barely make out the corners, which seemed to stretch away into nothingness. I felt trapped in a nightmare that had no escape. Where was I? Why was I here? What happened to the basement? What had happened to the thing I saw? I took a cautious step forward, my heart hammering in my chest, and then froze. A sound, soft at first but unmistakable, a scrape. The unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the floor. I felt my pulse spike. My body went rigid, my eyes darting wildly around the room. There was no place to hide, no escape. I backed into the corner, breathing in shallow gasps, the sound growing louder, closer. It was the same scraping noise I'd heard before, and now I was sure that whatever it was in the room with me. I strained my ears, trying to identify where it was coming from. The scraping was coming from everywhere. From above, from behind me. It was as if the room itself was alive with that horrible sound. Then, without warning, the bulb above me flickered violently, plunging me into darkness for a split second. When the light returned, I could see it, a figure just on the edge of my vision, crawling toward me with agonizing slowness. I recognized it instantly. The woman from the photographs. But this time her face wasn't hidden by shadow. Her features were exposed, twisted, and deformed. Her mouth stretched too wide, her eyes too dark, and her skin was pale, sickly, decayed in places. She moved like an insect, her limbs bending at odd angles as she crawled across the floor, dragging herself toward me with horrific determination. I stumbled back, my breath coming in panicked bursts. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something. Why wasn't I running? The woman stopped just a few feet away from me, her head cocked unnaturally to one side as though studying me. I could feel the weight of her gaze, cold and suffocating. She tilted her head even further, her grotesque smile widening. And then she spoke, her voice rasping, raw, like it was being forced out from deep within her. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice layered with something darker, something older. It felt like the words were meant for me specifically, like they had been waiting to be spoken, to sink deep into my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything. But my body betrayed me. I couldn't move. My mind was spinning, and I could feel myself slipping into a haze of terror. The more I stared at her, the more I felt something slipping, a sense of reality becoming less solid, like I was losing touch with the world around me. The woman's smile stretched even wider. It wasn't just a smile anymore. It was something else, something predatory. She opened her mouth as though to speak again, but instead of words, a sound came out, a high-pitched, bone-chilling scream that tore through the air like a jagged knife, slicing at my eardrums. The walls seemed to vibrate with the scream, the floor beneath me shaking. I covered my ears, but the sound pierced through, relentless. The light above flickered more violently, and for a moment I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the brief moments of light, I could see her true form, not just a woman anymore, but something much darker. Something inhuman. Her body twisted, her skin stretching, contorting as though it were breaking apart at the seams. Her eyes, those wide, empty eyes, were now completely black, swirling with an endless void. Her mouth was no longer just a smile. It was a gaping hole, dark and endless, threatening to swallow everything around it. I couldn't breathe. My throat was closing. I couldn't make a sound. But I could feel her. Her presence was overwhelming, consuming everything in the room. I took a step back, my feet dragging against the floor. The woman's smile faded, and she began to move again, the scraping noise growing louder, faster, as if she was going to lunge at me. Suddenly, I felt a tug at my arm, not from the woman, but from behind me. It was a pull, almost gentle at first, but as I turned, it became stronger, insistent. Someone was pulling me away from her. I didn't know if it was my mind cracking under the strain or if something else was in the room with me, but I didn't care. I didn't care how or why, I just had to escape. My legs moved again, my body willing itself to run, to get away. The last thing I saw as I stumbled backward was the woman's outstretched arm, fingers like claws reaching for me just before the darkness took me again. And then nothing. But in that nothingness, I heard it. You're not alone anymore. Thank you for listening till the end. I hope you were able to relax and will now get a good rest. And don't worry, new stories are already on the way for tomorrow. So don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to stay connected. Now have a good night. See you in the next episode.